So a number of months ago, we did a video going over Jesus' comments about the blood of all the prophets being laid to the Pharisees from the blood of Abel to Zechariah, and how that went follow the pattern of the Old Testament canon, the traditional Jewish Old Testament canon. Trent Horn reacted in March to a gentleman here about this topic. It's a few minutes. My comments are probably going to be a little bit longer, but I just wanted to react on this since all the information is fresh in my mind.
But Jesus also says in Matthew chapter 23 and 35, speaking of the Pharisees, he says, "And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth." Now watch this now. "From the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." What is Jesus saying? He's saying, hey, the blood from Abel, what book is that from? That's from the book of Genesis. And then who is one of the prophets towards the end of the Old Testament? Well, you have Malachi, you have Zechariah, you have Haggai. So this is referring once again to the Old Testament ending somewhere around Zechariah. So you have Genesis all the way through Zechariah or the book of Malachi.
Okay, I just wanted to interrupt here. We'll continue with this in a second. But he is not going to use the strongest form of this argument, which is that the Zechariah mentioned by Jesus is the Zechariah of Second Chronicles. Fortunately, and to Trent Horn's credit, he is going to be interacting with that stronger form of the argument. And I am going to look up the parallel passage. Bear with me. There might be some editing here. All right, so one of the things we wanted to mention, it's mentioned in the video, I'm going to have linked in the description, is that you don't see this as much in the Matthew passage, but in the parallel passage in Luke, we're talking about the blood of all the prophets. So we're starting at Abel, and we're going to Zechariah, which we can see here, and that represents the blood of all the prophets. So that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation. So when you put the two passages together, that is what kind of gives us that this stands from all the prophets ever. You don't quite pick that up just from the Matthew passage. So just wanted to point that out. Let's get back to the video.
My friend, if Jesus did not accept these books.
Okay, here's the problem with this argument. First, it assumes it's talking about Zechariah that is killed in the book of Second Chronicles, and it assumes that Second Chronicles was the last book of the Hebrew Bible, whereas.
So we go over in great detail in the video in the description, but we'll go over a little bit here. It is the Zechariah of Second Chronicles. It's not that we assume Jesus is using the canon, the traditional canon of Genesis to Chronicles. It's that this gives evidence that the canon existed in his day and that he was following that outline. So that's not quite the same thing as assuming. And because he was using that canon from Genesis to Second Chronicles, that shows us that he wasn't using a canon with the Deuterochronicles in it, or the Apocrypha. What we're arguing is that the canon, the traditional Jewish canon, makes Jesus' comment make sense.
Today, most Protestants would say that it's Malachi. So this argument rests on a ton of assumptions. Number one, it rests on an assumption that Jesus was talking about the canon of Scripture.
Jesus wasn't technically talking about the canon. He was using the canon in his comments. That's an important distinction.
You could have just been picking two famous prophets that span a long period of time.
All right, I want to mention, we really got to focus on this comment here. He could just be picking two prophets that span a long period of time. Well, according to Luke and Matthew, this Abel to Zechariah represents all the prophets. Let's go back to Luke here. Let's see. So that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged from this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. So Abel is clearly representing the first prophet ever. And we know Abel starts in the book of Genesis. So Jesus is talking about from point A to point B. Abel is the start. He's the first prophet ever. Why? Please fix this question in your mind. Why are we ending with Zechariah? Trent Horn can't answer this. And an answer is ready for us if we are if we're open to the possibility. Abel is at the beginning of Scripture. Zechariah is at the end. But Zechariah is at the end of the traditional Jewish canon, which Trent Horn can't have because that invalidates Roman Catholicism. Any answer you give has to explain the bookends of how it encompasses all the prophets, right, that we went over in Luke. Abel isn't an arbitrary starting point, and Zechariah won't be an arbitrary end point. So it's not just that it's a long period of time that Trent Horn wants to posit here, but it's an all-encompassing beginning and end point. Abel represents the beginning, Zechariah represents the end. And what I'm kind of seeing, at least with this snippet here, is that Trent Horn just wants to raise a lot of doubts so that you just have no idea what Jesus is talking about, which is kind of weird because I think one of the functions of Roman Catholicism, according to Catholic apologists, is to clarify, and he isn't willing to clarify what exactly is why is Zechariah the end point? Why is it all encompassing? He just wants to raise doubts so you don't raise doubts about the Catholic canon. So a little bit of an irony there. So again, Zechariah is not a arbitrary endpoint.
Without trying to make an assumption about what the canon of Scripture was. That's not what was being disputed. Jesus wasn't talking about that. That's assumption one.
All right, we already went over that. He's using the canon. He is not talking about the canon explicitly.
Assumption two, it assumes that 2 Chronicles was the last book, and that's the Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, that is being referenced there, the one that's in 2 Chronicles at the end of the Hebrew Bible. At least that's what usually I hear Protestants who make this kind of argument. And number three, it makes an assumption about which Zechariah that we're talking about. Because actually, Jesus seems to be speaking about another Zechariah. He talks about Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, in Matthew 23:35. And that's not the Zechariah from the book of Chronicles. That's the Zechariah from the book of Zechariah itself, which nobody says was the last book of the Old Testament canon. And so that would be different than Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, who I believe is the Zechariah that is killed in 2 Chronicles. Jesus is talking about another Zechariah. Now, some people will say, well, wait a minute, Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, it could be a different name. It could be a different way of referring to him. There's no reference to the prophet of the book of Zechariah being killed in the temple. That's not found in that book. It is found in extra-biblical sources, though. There are targums, which are kind of paraphrases, an Aramaic paraphrase or summary of the Hebrew books. The Targum of the Book of Lamentations refers to this Zechariah, the son of Iddo. Iddo would be his grandfather, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo. It says this Zechariah, who is the prophet Zechariah, was killed in the temple, actually. So Jesus may be referring to a completely different Zechariah. So the point is, this argument is very weak. It's not an argument to show the canon of Scripture because it rests on a ton of assumptions that may not be the case. So it does not establish the Protestant Old Testament's canon based on the weak assumptions that are found in it.
All right. Again, Trent Horn needs to explain the endpoint. Why does it make sense? Why does the canonical Zechariah, the Zechariah, the minor prophet, why is that the all-encompassing endpoint? Why isn't it John the Baptist? The blood of all the prophets, but John the Baptist was probably the last prophet I know who died, and he's not the endpoint. So that doesn't really make sense if he's not following the biblical canon. So he wants to say that there's no reference. We say yes, there's no reference. But he mentions the Targum. So as opposed to the Targum hurting the case that the endpoint is the Zechariah of 2nd Chronicles, it actually helps. Rabbinic tradition would sometimes conflate names with similar characteristics. We go over examples of that in the video, but one of the earliest ones that I want to mention is here, the preface to Psalm 34. All right, so let's look at the preface of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. Well, Abimelech was a Palestinian king, a Canaanite king in Abraham's time. So we see that this is an example of this name conflation. There was another Philistine king that David hid with. I forget his real name, but you see the name conflation here. Again, we go over this in our previous video. This is the earliest example, I think, of this practice that we see. Z.H. Chahes goes over it in his 19th century work. Again, we mentioned that again. So, does anyone think David had hid a second time with a different king who just had the same name? No one really thinks that. What the Targums are showing is that Jesus' use of Zechariah ben Iddo, the minor prophet, he was using a rabbinic practice, a rabbinic tradition of name conflation, which makes sense because he was talking to people who use that tradition and they would understand it. And I think this is why you can see it in Matthew but not in Luke. Luke just says Zechariah, and Matthew, a Jewish audience, it spells that out a little different. So we have a translation here of the Targum from C.M.M. Brady. I actually was talking with this gentleman not too long ago, which I will bring up. So let's look at verse 20. See, O Lord, and observe from heaven against what you have turned. This is right for the daughters of Israel to eat the fruit of their wombs due to starvation. The lovely boys wrapped in fine linen, the attribute of justice, replied, Is it right to kill the priest and prophet in the temple of the Lord, as when you killed Zechariah the son of Iddo, the high priest, and faithful prophet in the temple on the day of Atonement, Yom Kippur? I'm actually just so happened to be recording this on Yom Kippur, because he admonished you not to do evil before the Lord. All right. Things to observe here. The characteristics, admonish the people, was a priest, murdered on Yom Kippur. That is all described of the Zechariah of 2nd Chronicles and is mentioned 2 or 3 times in the Talmud. It's described in the Jerusalem Talmud, and I believe it's described a couple times in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, for you to hold this to be, you would have to have a lot of coincidences line up. I talked to Dr. Brady, and he is very much convinced that this is in error. And I went back at him and I said, okay, this is due to name conflation. Well, he said, we don't know the mind of the author. Whatever the case may be, it's factually in error. although he did start to open up the possibility of name conflation. And that's what a lot of people do with Jesus' comments. I think a Mormon source I mentioned in the previous video does that. They say Jesus just made a factual error. And you just have to throw out inerrancy or infallibility to get to this. So a much simpler explanation is it's just the rabbinic name conflation. Or if it was an error, that he and Dr. Brady agrees with this, is that Jesus was using, at least by the time of Jesus, it was a common he's using just a common rabbinic tradition, so it wouldn't be an error on Jesus' part. I believe the other thing that would have, there's two other things that would have me doubt this. Well, the third would be, why would you end with Zechariah ben Iddo as opposed to John the Baptist if he's not following the canon? Okay, so besides the not being able to explain the end point, one of the first reasons is we do have an example, at least in rabbinic thought, of something, of a divine occurrence of something happening hundreds of years apart. And that would be the destruction of the temple happening on the same day. And it's mentioned. The same Zechariah being murdered, or a similar sounding name being murdered in the same exact way, in the same manner, on Yom Kippur, just escapes their notice. We don't have a record of that. Outside of potentially the Targum, which again, name conflation perfectly describes that. The second reason what I would mention was that Zechariah ben Iddo was in the time of Ezra, and Ezra at that time was a fine time. I mean, granted, it wasn't perfect, but it's not like in the Second Chronicles where things are going downhill fast before the Babylonians come in. So that doesn't a murder of a priest on Yom Kippur is definitely very much, to me, and I think anybody would take that as a sign of the end. So there was no end. It isn't a sign of the end if it happened in Ezra's time. So again, that wouldn't make sense. But maybe you're holding out hope against hope. So let's say it's not name conflation, and everybody who thinks the Targum or Jesus made an error is wrong. How does Ben Iddo represent the end point? And the fact of the matter is that Trent Horn can't explain that. And that is the biggest difficulty here. He doesn't want the Roman Catholic canon to be wrong, but he can't explain the text. And again, I have to point out the irony is that Roman Catholicism is supposed to be able to explain text, but they need to muddy the waters in order to keep their official canon decree in Trent intact. Okay? Leave me a comment if you have any other questions. I highly recommend watching my previous video. God bless.